Well, hi YouTube, and welcome back to all my Buster buddies. It's your big kahuna here, Brad, and this is Brad's Boredom Busters, your textile art channel. This is the channel where we have fun with fabric. Yes, and on this episode it is going to be part 2 of our picture puzzle piecing video. So in the first episode we created our art quilt, and we got up to the point where we're ready to do all our quilting. And so now let's continue on with it. Okay, Busters, I'm all set up. I've got a light green thread in for my satin stitching, but I've got black in for the bobbin, considering underneath is black. Okay, so I am going to do some of the veining. I won't make you sit through the whole thing, but I'll just do some of it and let you see how that works, and then I'll turn off the camera, finish up, then I'll come back and we'll change thread to actually stitch out all these raw edges, but I wanted to establish the veining first. So let's get going with that. All right, see if you can see that right there. So that's the satin stitching for the veining on the leaf. I will continue doing that on all the branches of this veining. And then, like I say, when I'm finished with that, we'll come back and I'll do the satin stitch around all these other elements, and I'll show you what that looks like. The settings for my satin stitch. So I've got a 3.5 millimeter width, length on the stitch to create the satin stitching is 0.1 millimeter, and then my tension, like I say, that's up to you to determine for your own personal machine. Turn off the camera, and I'll do really the whole rest of the leaf, the lighter or medium green color, and then everything else. So when you next see it, I'll have all that satin stitching done, and then we'll be ready to do our thread painting. So let me stitch up a little of this. And every time you do and even with your satin stitches, start it, but then back stitch to help lock that in, and then do a back stitch at the end of your row to lock that in so it doesn't unravel in the future. Alright, Busters, so here's the leaf after I've done all my satin stitching. So the next part of the process is laying out where I want to do some thread painting. And if you're not familiar with that or that term, thread painting is nothing more than some free motion sewing. But what you do is you just kind of move it around back and forth just to fill in particular areas with a colored thread to give an effect of shadow or highlight or texture or anything like that. So that'll be the next thing I do. So I will take my drawing here, because I have areas indicated for thread painting. So I will take this piece and then with a pencil draw out where I want the thread painting to be done. And so let me do that, and then we'll meet back at my sewing machine and we'll start doing some thread painting. The other thing I did that you probably can't see because I did it with black thread, after I did all the satin stitching here, I also did a basting stitch all around the outside just to kind of lock that down because I'm not doing any stitching out here. So I just wanted to anchor that down. We will probably cut some of it off because after I do the thread painting, then we can actually square up our little quilt here and cut off all the excess material. Okay, Busters, so we're here at my sewing machine again. And so thread painting is basically just free motion sewing. So I need to change over my presser foot. And I like to use this clear plastic one for thread painting because you can see kind of all around where you're going and, you know, kind of what it's looking like underneath the foot. So yeah, I recommend that for thread painting. I've got my slip mat down on my sewing machine, so let me change out this foot. Okay, so that's set up. As I mentioned, the method of thread painting is basically a free motion sewing technique. And so because of that, I've got my sewing machine set up for free motion, which means the feed dogs are down. So I transferred my details of the areas that are going to be thread painted onto the quilt itself. And what you want to do, just to kind of keep things straight in your mind, is write on your drawing here and just give, you know, kind of a little clue about what color thread you're putting on there. So I've got LG for light green. I've got some areas that are going to be white thread. So I've got WTH. And I know I have a couple areas that are dark green as well. So just make those notes on your drawing. So that way when you go to do the actual thread painting, you don't get confused about what color goes where. So I will set that off to the side so I can refer to it when I need it. I've got dark green in my machine at the moment. And per usual, I won't make you watch the whole process. It takes a little while, but I will demonstrate one area here and let you see how that works and what it looks like. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention about when you're doing thread painting. If you're doing it on like this leaf, the leaf has shape to it, roundness. So you want the direction of your thread movement to go in that same direction. So, you know, if I've got an area here that's a very fine shape, but like down here where this is going to be light green, so I wouldn't thread paint going horizontally. I want to go, you know, up and down in the direction that the leaf would be shaped. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your thread painting. Okay, Busters, so I was having a little bit of an issue with the original setup that I had going on. So you see I finished this. So originally I just had my universal needle in there and I was breaking the thread. So I had to switch over to a 90-14 top stitch needle. It has a little bit larger eye in it. And then I also slowed down my sewing machine a little bit so it wasn't quite, you know, working so fast. And then that seemed to help the issue. So you may have to just play with your machine too to see, what combination works just right so you can accomplish the thread painting. But I've got another little area here for a dark thread, so I'll show you that. Okay, Busters, so that's kind of what the thread painting looks like. That's a highlight on the leaf. And so I've got more to do, and so like I say, I'll show you what it all looks like when I'm finished. Okay, Buster Buddies, so here is my leaf after I've done all my thread painting. Yep, I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. So now I can pull my safety pins. Now's the time to square up the panel before we cut our binding, and then we're also going to, I'll show you how to cut and make hanging loops for the quilt as well. And so let's go ahead and remove the safety pins, and then I'll show you how I square up the panel. Oh, let me give you a little heads up. So after you get the safety pins off and we go to square this up, lay your quilting ruler, and it's best if you have a long 24-inch, but you want to lay it down and find your straightest edge, because I think this one, sometimes the quilting will distort your panel, and that's why you square it up after you're done with all the quilting. And so you find your straightest edge and cut that, determine how wide you want your border panel to look. And so cut that one first, and then you square off of your truest edge. So you may have one that you end up squaring up, and it may trim off a little funny just because if it's distorted. But then when you put your binding on, a lot of time that helps hide that as well. All right, let's get these pins off, and I'll show you how to square up your panel. Okay, got all the pins off. Let's get those out of the way. So we'll put those in our little box here in a little while. Okay, so the sides are pretty true. The top here isn't bad. So I think we will square up the top first and then trim both sides and do this bottom last. So I want to trim that down to 1.5. So you can put just a dead weight on the one end. Make sure it's still on its marks. There we go. Then you can cut with confidence without worrying about it shifting. Okay. Okay, so as I said before, I know I have a little bit of a bow here. So what I am looking at is one, because I know this is a good straight edge, having one of my straight marks right on that, and then coming is close to me, you know, in this close corner at 1.5 inches, and then also hit it here on this corner at 1.5 inches, and then don't worry about how it's transitioning there in the middle. And then you can make your cut there. And then that'll straighten that bottom edge out, and it'll look good when you put your binding on. Okay, there we go. Alright, so there we are, nice and clean and squared up. And so here in a little while we'll take this back over to the sewing machine and then stitch all this edge down. Alright, so now let's cut material for our loops and then also for the binding. So I was planning on making a two-tone loop, and I'll show you how to do that. That's real easy. For the loops, you can kind of guesstimate on a smaller project like this. They don't need to be too long. So let's see what we have here. These leftovers. Leftovers might be the right size. Yeah. It'll finish off at about 3 inches. So we have 7 inches. Okay. So you can cut 3, and I have 2 here already just because they're leftover, so I'll cut 1 more. But these are 2-inch by 7-inch, and we can cut 1 more at 7 inches. So set your 7-inch mark there. Okay. So that's the 3 primaries for that. And so then what you will need for those is 3 more pieces that are 7 inches long but 3 inches wide. And so you may be wondering why you're doing them 3 inches wide when the others are 2 inches wide. When you sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then you press that flat, you'll end up with a 1/4 inch on either side of the loop. And so that'll give you your little borders. Alright, so there's those 3 and those 3. So that's all we need for that. We'll take those to the sewing machine in a little bit. Okay, so now let's create our binding. So there are 2 common widths to cut your binding at, either 2 1/4 or 2 1/2. Because this project's a little bit smaller, I'm going to do it at 2 1/4. You want to cut your binding on the straight of the grain of your fabric. Now, if you've never been taught how to determine the grain of your fabric, because it does have a grain. You have the straight of the grain usually is running parallel to your, go here. It usually runs parallel to the salvage of the fabric, and the way you can tell that is how it stretches. So here, let me bring it this way. So take your fabric, and you can take it near the selvage, and then try to pull it. There's no stretch there. Now you can pull it the other way, and there's a little bit of stretch. Almost none either. Now, if you've ever heard the term cutting on the bias of your fabric means diagonally at 45 degrees. That way there is a great deal of stretch. See that? So it stretches that way, it'll stretch this way as well. So you don't want your binding to stretch when you're sewing it. So you can cut it with the selvage or at 90 degrees to it, which it gives you a little stretch. My selvage width is too narrow, so I am actually going to cut my binding perpendicular to the selvage, which is okay, but you definitely just don't want to cut it on the bias. So let me straighten this out, and like I said, I'm cutting it at 2 1/4. And let me fold this in half because it's just slightly wider than my ruler. So there's our binding strips. I'm going to set up my ironing board. I want to iron these out flat because they're creased, and so is some of the pieces for these hanging loops. So let me get that ironed up, and then we will meet back at the sewing machine. Okay, Busters, so I went around the whole quilt and pinned my border down, seeing we cut off all the basting stitches before. All right, so I've got my 1/4 inch presser foot on. I switched over to black thread for this edge, and so let's just get this stitched down, and then we can proceed to the next step. And remember to always back stitch at the beginning and at the end of your rows, or if you have a needle down function, you can pivot at the corners, and then when you finish back here at the beginning, you can back stitch there. Oh, wanted to tell you guys also before I get started on this, I have changed my sewing needle. We were using the top stitch needle for the thread painting, so I've switched over to the universal again, still in 9014, and that's what we'll finish off this whole job with now. All right, let's get going. Okay, so there's all the way around, so I'll pull the pins and then we'll get set up for our next step. Okay, Busters, I'm going to switch over now to the light green thread for the rest of the project. This will put together the hanging loops, and then we'll stitch together the binding with this, and then sew the binding onto the quilt with this. So let me get this loaded and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, Busters, so we have our pieces cut here for the 3 hangers that are going to be on our art quilt. And so the way you sew these together, very simple. So take your widest piece and then take the narrower piece and put those face down to each other, or right sides to each other. And then line up one edge. And then with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I've still got the 1/4 inch foot on here. Stitch down that side. Then when you got that stitched, then flip it over and just pull this short side over to this longer side and then stitch it again. And then we pull it right side out and iron it flat. So I'll show you on one, I'll do the other 2 off camera. All right, then you just take your piece and you pull that right side out. And that's definitely why you want to always back stitch at the beginning and end, just because you have to really kind of work the fabric sometimes, and you want to make sure it has enough reinforcement at the beginning and the end to withstand the manipulations you have to do. Okay, there you go. So then we'll take that to the ironing board and just iron that out flat. I'll stitch up the other 2 and then we'll iron them out at the same time. Okay, Busters, so here's our 3 hangers all stitched up. So all you have to do is press them out, just kind of even out the sides by hand. And then you just kind of run it. And you want to steam press these so they hold their shape. Just like that. And then they're real pretty. They look real nice when they're all put on your art quilt, hanging there. Gives it a nice little bit of flair when it's instead of just single colored hangers. Yeah, I like doing these 2-tone ones. They just give it a little extra. Alright, so that's that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is go back to the sewing machine. We have to stitch together our binding strips, and so I'll show you that next. Okay, gang, so if you've never made binding strips before, it's really easy. You take just whatever length of fabric you have. Like I say, we've cut these at 2 1/4 wide. And what you're going to do is you're going to take one strip, lay it, say left to right, and then take the other one and lay it on top, going up and down. And then what you will do is take this to your sewing machine and you will stitch it on the diagonal. So you'll sew from this point down to this point. Yep, that's all you have to do. That's really simple. So you just lay it under your foot, line it up there, and just eyeball it straight across. Just like that. And then you'll take and just trim off the excess, you know, leave about 1/4 inch. And then when we're done sewing all the pieces together, we'll take this back to the ironing board, and then we'll lay the seam allowance. I like to kind of butterfly it, open it up so it's flat going both ways. It reduces the bulk. And then we'll steam press that seam open. So then when we iron this to create our binding strip, the seam allowance there isn't too bulky. All right, so just continue sewing these pieces together. And that's how you create your binding strip. All right, so let me finish this up. I'll show you the next step to creating your binding strip. Okay, Busters, so I'll show you how to create your binding for your quilt. So we've got all our pieces sewn together. So as I said at the sewing machine, you want to just kind of finger press this at first just to open it up. And then you want to iron down all the pieces that you've attached together just to flatten that out. And you go along and just do the whole strip. Okay, so that's that. So now the next step in creating your binding is we have to iron this piece in half. And so you'll lay it face down, and then you just want to bring over one edge to the other. And you just do that for the whole length of your binding strip. So I will continue pressing this, and then as soon as I get this done, the next step is going back to the sewing machine and actually sewing on our hanging loops onto the quilt. And so I will see you back at the sewing machine. Okay, so now we're ready to attach our hanging loops. And so the way you do that is you just simply, because they get attached before your binding goes on. So you take one of your loops and you fold it in half like that. And then I usually, you want to measure out because you want to leave enough room to come around with the binding and your presser foot, so that's not in the way. So I usually come in about 1 inch. There, that's good. Okay, so that's 1 inch in. And then you want to take and make sure that's even to the outside edge of your quilt and have it fairly square. And then you want to just pin that in place and pin it down far enough so the pin's not in the way. And most of the time you're going to have at minimum 3 hangers to a quilt. And so you'll put another one on the other end, same distance apart, or same distance away from the edge. And then you just want to find the center of your project. It'll go on either side of center. Okay, very good. And then what you'll do is you'll stitch that down less than a 1/4 inch away from the top. So, you know, use your 1/4 inch foot, but then stay, like mine has a guide on the side. So have the guide floating out here a little bit. So you're about 1/8 of an inch away. Because then the next thing we'll do is we'll sew the binding on, and then the binding will be at a 1/4 inch. And so these get sewn in actually a couple different times, so they'll be quite reinforced. But let's stitch them down first, so that way, you know, if the pins are in the way, you can remove them. But it's a good idea to leave the pins in place until your binding is finished. Keeps it from getting caught under the presser foot. So let's get these stitched in. All right, so there's your loops all stitched in place. So the next thing we are going to do is get our binding on. So you'll take your binding strip and I mean, there's different ideas about it, but the way I like to do it, I start my binding on the back of the project, stitch that all the way around, and then finish it off in the front. And so you want to take your binding, take the raw edge, and lay it even to the raw edge of your quilt. And then you overlap a long piece here, because this is where we will connect as we come all the way around. So you want to leave a long tail and then start past center stitching, and then go around and finish back here, leaving a long tail, and stop stitching well to the, well, in this case, well to my right of center. And then I'll show you how to join the binding together once we make it all the way around. And then all of this will be done with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and make sure you back stitch here to reinforce it. And then when we stitch down here, stop a 1/4 inch away from the corner, and then I'll show you how to make the corner transition. Okay, when you get up to the corner, You can cut your thread here because you're going to take this out to make the corner transition. So you would take your binding, fold it back onto itself. Let's see, get this so you can see it a little better. Alright, so we'll take the binding, fold it back onto itself, and then square that up to the edge again. So you'll have the raw edge along the raw edge of the quilt, and then a folded edge at the top, so that kind of boxes that in. Then you continue down the side with your stitching. I will finish stitching the binding down, and when I get here to the bottom, then I'll show you how to make the transition and attach the two together. Alright, Busters, so I've made it all the way around, and so what you want to do now is you've got to cut both these ends off, but you want to have an overlap from one to the other. You want them to overlap the same distance that the width is of your binding. So if you cut a 2.5 inch binding width, then you'll overlap them 2.5. This is 2.25, so we will cut the bottom one first, and then I'll overlap the top one 2.25 inches, and then cut it there. And so I want to be, let me say, past center a bit. So we can cut here. And then I am going to take a ruler to make sure I have it right. So we want 2.25. So it gets cut here. Okay, so now the next thing you want to do is sew that together in the same fashion that you sewed all of the pieces together. Okay, Busters, here's your big kahuna, giving you another epic voiceover because I forgot to turn the microphone on again. Yeah, for my camera, it's a two-step process, and sometimes I get in a hurry and just forget. Anyway, we are at the point where I'm showing you how to finish the binding on your quilt. And so this is always something I've struggled with, and I finally was shown the right way to do it, and it's if you know the right way to do it, it's not that hard. But in the past, before I was shown really the proper way to do it, I'd try it and I'd always get my binding twisted. So anyway, obviously this voiceover isn't going to follow the video, verbatim, but let me just simplify it. Then you take your tail end of the binding that is on the right hand side, and you want to lay that on the table face up. Then you take the left one, and you'll probably have to scrunch up the quilt the way that I did in the video. You have to kind of fold it so you can bring the left side closer to the right side. But then you lay the left piece face down,
perpendicular to the right piece, so it looks basically the same way as when you created your binding. And so then if it helps to pin that together, go ahead and do that. But then once you lay the left over the right, then you want to sew diagonally from the top corner to the bottom inside corner, and then that will give you the binding joining in the right position. So you'll cut off the excess and leave a 1/4 inch, and then straighten out your quilt, and that will straighten out the binding. It'll automatically fold back up where you had ironed it previously. Okay, so now that we've got our binding attached to our quilt on the back side, start at the bottom again, and you fold the binding, and it's you're hanging on to the folded edge. You pull that around to the front, and you can pin this if it makes it easier for you to get it under your sewing machine, but place the binding against your quilt, and then with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the bottom edge of the quilt or the outside edge of the quilt, then start stitching toward the corner. When you get within an inch of the corner, then stop with your needle down and take the part of the binding that you're stitching down, hold that down flat, and then on the perpendicular edge, fold that piece of binding over the top of your first piece of binding and create a 45-degree miter, a 45-degree mitered corner. And then you can stitch, then start stitching over that miter, but stop the needle down anywhere from a 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and then raise your presser foot and pivot your quilt so you can start stitching going up the next side, and then just keep pulling the binding over and stitching it down a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And when you get to the next corner, repeat the same process, create your mitered corner. You keep repeating this process all the way around the quilt till you get back to the bottom, and then overlap your stitching, back stitch to lock your stitches in, and then you're finished.
Okay, so you've gone all the way around, stitched it all out, so now's the time you can pull your straight pins off of the hanging loops. So that's how that looks, just like that. And I've got one little other idea, something you may or may not want to do. I've got a special piece for hanging this with, so let me go grab that and I'll be right back. Okay, Busters, so this winter had quite a bit of wind, and I've got a lot of fir trees out behind my house. I had several limbs come down, and I thought it'd be really cool. I cut this one limb to size, thought it would look really cool, give it a nice rustic look as the hanging stick for it, and so you could hang this up on the wall and give it a real different, interesting look. It kind of ties in with the floral theme of this art quilt. All right, hey, I hope you enjoyed this project. Hey, if you liked it, give me a thumbs up. That really helps me out. Yep, this one came out good. I say, it's a fun project. I hope you learned something new about the piecing techniques on this. Yeah, it really makes it capable of creating all sorts of pictures doing this type of piecing process. Okay, let's head back to the desk and we'll do a sign off. All right, we'll see you there. All right, hey, a big shout out to all my beautiful Buster buddies. This is your favorite fabric friend, Brad, and I just had to talk to you before we signed off today. Hey, mentioned before that when I hit 1,000 subscribers, I was going to do a giveaway. Well, at the videoing of this episode, I'm at 950. So, hey, share my videos around to all your friends so we can hit that 1,000 mark. Because, yes, I am still planning on doing a giveaway. It'll be your choice of either a tapestry, a tie-dye shirt, or a bleach painting shirt. So, make sure you tell all your friends about Brad's Boredom Busters. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. And if you really like my content, please give me a thumbs up. And if you really like it, go to my Buy Me a Coffee page and buy me a coffee. That really helps out my channel as well. So hey, I love you all people. Peace out, baby, and go bust out some art.